one of the most important questions and one of the main points that we were talking about it before coming to live is that what exactly was the Anchorage formula as referenced by Russian officials? And in what ways do current US sanctioned enforcement measures, such as tanker interceptions, undermine and contradict
Mhm.
Russia's interpretation of that formula? And what is the difference? It seems that the both sides, their perception is somehow different. And what is your understanding of that?
Well, it's a very important new development, so that everybody should understand here. Um, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, has declared war on Dmitry Peskov, the president's spokesman. Let me explain how this works. And you've introduced it as the argument over the so-called Anchorage formula. The Anchorage formula is a slogan that the Russian side has been using. President Putin has repeated it many times, and therefore his spokesman has repeated it many times, as a formula that they allege to have been agreed with President Trump during the Anchorage summit meeting last August. Let's remember, because we did a program about that Trump walked away abruptly halfway through that summit meeting. The summit meeting papers indicated the plan on the US side was for at least 4 hours, a 45-minute press conference, a lunch with an extended delegation, and so forth and so on. Trump walked away, cut it short. This is not part of the formula. What happened, according to my Russian sources, is that President Putin lectured Trump and believed that Trump understood that a variety of Russian concerns, the so-called root causes of conflict that led to the battlefield war that precedes the special military operation. Putin believed, Trump agreed, but Trump left quickly. His attention span is not high level. He left quickly. And ever since then, the Russian side, as it dealt with Trump's emissary, particularly Stephen Witkoff, have seen that Trump is the opportunity to make an end of the war in the Ukraine and reopen economic relations, business as usual with the Americans, and to some extent recover from the damage sanctions have done, including the freezing of the central bank's $200 to $300 billion worth of reserves. The formula has factional meaning in Moscow politics, in Kremlin politics. On the one hand, Kirill Dmitriev, the so-called business representative of the president, who negotiates directly with Witkoff, directly with Besant, directly with other members of the administration. Kirill Dmitriev, Elvira Nabiullina, the governor of the central bank, and business constituents, let's call them the oligarchs for short, have all wanted a shortening of the war, a resumption of US relations. They believe that the deal, and Dmitriev celebrates it in self-advertising tweets, the deal has been done. And indeed, my Russian sources confirm that largely the negotiations with Witkoff and Kushner have resulted in their appearing to accept that Russia has won on the battlefield and that there are a number of ways in which the sides can agree on reopening business relations, stopping the sanctions war, and so forth. That's what they think they've agreed with Witkoff. We can go into more details about what they plan to do. It's essentially privatize the 200x billion worth of central bank reserves, privatize them in a US-Russian fund, which Kushner, Witkoff, and Dmitriev would oversee. Privatizing state property is a rather unusual way of solving a war, but that's what they think they've achieved. At the same time, that is not the view of the General Staff, and it's not the view of Sergei Lavrov, and it's not the view of the intelligence services, and appears not to be the consensus of the Security Council advising the president. They believe the United States wants to get out of a losing war on the battlefield in Ukraine and make a tactical withdrawal, so it does not appear to be a retreat, a rout. As they withdraw, they want to reinforce as much of the Ukrainian armed forces as will continue in the future to harass, attack, terrorize, and continue their war against Russia. So conserving them as the US withdraws is a major objective. Conserving European readiness to continue the war against Russia on the other fronts, Poland, Finland, up to the Arctic, northern route, and so forth. That's another US strategic objective, as the Russian side, except for the business representatives, think. Now, what's happened is that for some weeks and months, the foreign ministry has been saying that there is such an escalation of sanctions against Russia, against Russia's ability to trade its oil and so forth, that the so-called Anchorage formula, an agreement on reducing tension and ending war, that formula no longer exists. When a deputy foreign minister said it, he's been corrected by Kremlin. This time, Foreign Minister Lavrov said it as bluntly as it's possible. I'll read it out quickly. And then he was as it were, rejected. The position was rejected by Peskov. I'll read that too. So basically what Lavrov said on February the 9th in an interview in Moscow was that the Trump-Putin meeting in Anchorage told us that the Ukraine problem should be resolved. In Anchorage, we accepted the US proposal. Quote, I'm quoting, if we regard it as gentlemen, it means that they proposed it and we agreed. So the problem must be resolved. So far, and this is where Lavrov declares war, the reality is quite the opposite. New sanctions are imposed. A war against tankers in the open sea is being waged in violation of the UN Convention on the Law of Sea. They are trying to ban India and our other partners from buying cheap, affordable Russian energy. This means the Americans have set themselves the task of achieving economic domination. Furthermore, while they ostensibly make a proposal regarding Ukraine, and we were ready to accept it, now they are not, we do not see any bright future in the economic sphere either. The Americans want to take control of all the routes for providing the world's leading countries, all continents, with energy resources. And it goes on. Now, this he said on February the 9th. And TASS reports, I'm looking down, I'm shuffling papers so that I can give our audience exact quotes. Peskov says to TASS, and he calls them in, remember. He doesn't just suddenly say something. He's responding to what Lavrov says. The spirit of Anchorage, says Peskov, speaking for the president, reflects a set of mutual understandings between Russia and the United States that are capable of bringing about a breakthrough, including in the settlement between Moscow and Kiev. There is a whole range of understandings that were reached in Anchorage, which were already discussed even before Anchorage, during Mr. Witkoff's visit here. And it was after this that the need for a summit meeting arose. These understandings achieved in Anchorage are fundamental, and it's these understandings that can move the settlement process forward and allow for a breakthrough. He then refused to go into the details, answering your question, what the hell is the Anchorage formula? Now, that's faction fighting. It's as clear as day. Let me go back to what Russian sources tell me is the behavior of Vitkov and Kushner in the negotiating room, as happened in Abu Dhabi recently. But they report this is how Vitkov behaves in Moscow as well. They regard Vitkov as extremely crude, very arrogant. They regard Kushner as somebody who almost never says anything. Kushner behaves as if Vitkov is a father figure. He's there to symbolize Trump's presence, but he does no negotiating, no talking. That's odd for those who are sitting in the room watching the two of them. But Vitkov is in fact obsessed with the notion of a projecting military force, projecting military power, US power that's decisive. He's therefore confident at all times that he and his military can enforce a settlement, as they believe they have done in Gaza, as they believe they could do in Iran, as he believes that they have done in Venezuela, could do in Cuba, and so forth and so on. But in the Ukraine, as we saw in Abu Dhabi this time, there had to be senior military officers. General Alexis Grinkevich, the commander of the European Command, was to the right of the table, the American delegation, if you look at it. And on the far left, General Adamski, I believe, the head of J2, the intelligence, military intelligence for the European Command. In other words, military officers were talking to the Admiral Kostyukov, General Fomin, and General Zorin on the Russian side, and the Ukrainian military figures, including the Chief of Staff Gnatov. What has happened here is that Dmitriev's confidence that Vitkov can be bribed, that the Trump family can be bribed, that the huge billion-dollar deals, including with Russian reserves, can generate returns for the Trump family, returns for the Vitkov family, and so forth. That these lures are in fact achieving economic coordination between the two. They do not want any form of resistance, especially not at sea. They are absolutely determined to block any conflict, clash between Russian forces and American forces. Now, as you point out, as Lavrov pointed out, as clear as day, as the Americans have been negotiating a tactical withdrawal from the Ukrainian battlefield because they are losing and they want to conserve their forces from total capitulation and destruction, the Americans have been escalating at sea. So they're attacking every single major sea route. They seized the Russian flag vessel, the Marinera, was reflagged as it sailed off the coast of Scotland near Iceland. They are expanding in the Baltic through Estonia, Poland, and Germany. They've expanded in the Central Atlantic off the coast of France. They've expanded and aggressively in the Danish Straits through Denmark. We've seen them, and we've talked about all of these incidents. Attacks off the coast of Crete in the Mediterranean. Russian vessels have been sunk. So-called sabotage off the coast of Algeria at the end of 2024. And I'm not even including the war at sea in the Black Sea. So what we have, including the most recent seizure of vessels, is what Lavrov's called piracy. Now, piracy happens when vessels are not Russian flagged, but increasingly the 1,500 tanker fleet, or the between 1,300 and 1,500 Russian oil tankers, are not all working for Russia. Only about 15% of them are Russian flagged, but the speed at which Russian flagging has occurred is now accelerating. The question then becomes, and it's a fraught question, a controversial question in Moscow right now, what can the Russian Navy, what can the Russian Air Force, what will the commander-in-chief agree to do to defend this fleet from US attack? And you can very well understand when Lavrov says this level of attack on our vessels, on our trade, whether it's flagged or not, it's still Russian trade, is an escalation that has nothing to do with, violates whatever understanding was reached in Anchorage. So now they're having an argument. And in December, Admiral Moiseev, Alexander Moiseev, the Russian naval commander, wrote a piece, published a piece in a military magazine, Military Thought it's called in English, arguing that you must have Russian naval protection for the trade to keep the trade routes open. Now, that's easier said for the Arctic route because there's a Russian shore, there are Russian bases. It's not so easy to project Russian naval power far off Russian shores where the US have bases. And we've just seen a major interception and seizure of a vessel, not a Russian flag vessel, in the Indian Ocean. The Americans, for the time being, keeping it secret. It appears to have been in the Western Indian Ocean. And it takes a lot of effort for the US Navy and its shore bases, Singapore, Diego Garcia, and elsewhere, to mount these operations. However, it's clear it's a war against Russia at sea. It's clear it's got economic target. And it's clear that Dmitriev and that faction in Moscow have nothing to add to the defense. And they don't want their, as it were, business as usual doctrine to be undermined if there's a clash between Russian naval support for Russian flag vessels. Now, years ago, I wrote a book about Sovcomflot. The book's called Sovcomplot, published 2023. It's very difficult to have gotten President Putin then to make the decisions that are required to run one of the world's largest fleets, as Sovcomflot was then. Now it's sanctioned. It's very difficult to run that fleet without controversy, without faction fighting, without corruption. It was very difficult then without war. Now we're at war, and the Sovcomflot fleet is a major Russian defense of its trade. And it's very difficult in Moscow terms to get President Putin to decide not only how Sovcomflot should function, that's been half decided by, as it were, keeping the fleet in the dark. Now that doesn't work. You can't have the Russian Navy defend unflagged vessels. The Russian Navy must defend Russian flagged vessels. And we discussed this in an earlier program. But to reflag the fleet and then to deploy Russian Navy means a serious military problem, and for the Dmitriev faction, a serious challenge to their power. So, Sergei Lavrov has thrown down a gauntlet. We must defend. And that means the Navy, the Air Force, and it means lots of things. Shore alliances, shore alliance with India for the Indian Ocean, shore alliance with China for the Pacific, and so on and so forth. There are huge strategic problems to be solved here, military and technical problems to be solved, and Dmitriev's opposed to it. He thinks Vitkov and he made a deal. Vitkov, on the other hand, enjoys this projection of power, supports this projection of power. And so we're not quite as close to a peace treaty, an end of war, as some folks want to say, even if the Ukrainian military capitulated on that battlefield.
John, I was wondering how all of what you've mentioned is serious and is important to be considered, I think, not only for Russia, but for all the countries. I'm talking
Yeah.
about Iran and the Middle East and maybe China as well. And how do these US tanker seizures and maritime interdictions escalate the conflict with Russia or somehow with other countries as well and reshape global perception of US naval power? Do you think that after all these countries all they have they will come together, or there's somehow they would go after some sort of solution for what's going on? Because after all, the United States, it seems to me that they want to dominate everything, but how is that going to be perceived by other countries?
Well, each country is going to have to look to its own interests. Yes. And we've just seen a very significant division, disagreement surfaced by Yuri Ushakov after the telephone or video conference that was held between President Putin and the Chinese President Xi Jinping last week. And in that readout from Ushakov, we see disagreement. The words used, and it's unusual to see Ushakov produce a readout of a conference call with President Xi. I'm just shuffling papers to get the words, because it repeats the Russian disclosure, let's say, that Lavrov disclosed last December, when Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, came to Moscow and met with the Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu and Foreign Minister Lavrov. What was said indicates that there are significant points of difference, that the two sides' positions overlapped, closely coordinated, didn't quite agree, but the points of disagreement have not been identified. And the Russian side have chosen, please, if everybody wants to dispute this, I'll produce the papers, but because we don't have very much time, I'll just scoot over the exact words. There was a disclosure by the Russian side that there is a point of disagreement that's important for the Russian side to surface. Lavrov did it in December. Ushakov just did it last week. So, coming back to your question, we don't know what that point of disagreement is, and the Chinese readouts are so empty of information as not to admit even what the Russian side has admitted. Is there a concern between the two sides, for example, on preserving the oil trade, the seaborne trade that carries Russian goods, not only energy goods, to China, in the event that the United States starts to try to intercept and stop that trade? For the time being, and we said it a long time back, when Trump actually relieved China of the Rosneft Lukoil sanction that was introduced last year, Trump enforced it against India, relieved it against China. Okay, but what if it changed? We would expect it would be normal for the Russian side and the Chinese side, at the level of Security Council, level of Navy, at the level of senior officials, and then kicked up to the summit, to be discussing how to coordinate shore action to facilitate defense against these US-based driven interceptions at sea. We know that, for example, the Marinera required a US base practicing interception on Scottish shore with the British. We don't know exactly what US base was used to intercept the Aquila II, which was the most recent interception. What we must understand now is for Admiral Moiseyev's strategy of, pardon me, Russian Navy protection in convoy, air overflights, naval escorts. You need shore bases, okay? Shore bases in the Indian Ocean means India. Shore bases in the Pacific means China. Our shore bases in the Arctic, that's Russian. That's less of a problem. Our shore bases in the Baltic, less of a problem. Shore bases in the Black Sea, less of a problem. But there's clearly a need now for coordination between Russia and India and between Russia and China. Is that one of the points of disagreement with China? We don't know, but I'm making it public because the Russian side's made it public, except it isn't seen to have been made public. Now, the Indian side, during the Putin-Modi summit meetings in Delhi in December, and we talked about it then, have agreed to a variety of coordinated deployments so that Indian military can use Russian ports and vice versa. US have similar relationships with Pakistan for the Indian Ocean. They use Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean. They have bases all the way to the east in Singapore. So we know that Trump is enforcing the so-called promise of Prime Minister Modi that India will cut its oil imports from Russia. And the Indians are indeed reducing and will reduce over time. On the other hand, there have been vessel interceptions, allegedly in relation to Iranian oil movement off Mumbai, off the coast of India, in the last few days and hours. So what we have to assume what must be happening is the three allies, India, China, and Russia, in support of their allies, including Iran, in support of the oil trade that's vital to all three, must be negotiating naval cooperation to protect these convoys, these trade routes, these straits, Gibraltar, Malacca, Danish Straits, the Dardanelles, and so forth. They must cooperate. And do they disagree? Is everyone wanting to make their own deal with the United States? We don't know yet. That's why we're discussing it. That's why it isn't quite such good news from podcast terms. And that's why there's an argument in Moscow right